Before New York's skyline rose, the harbor hid 220,000 acres of oyster reefs so vast that Dutch ships steered wide around Manhattan to avoid running aground. Generations lived on their abundance until overharvest and sewage blackened the water and erased the reefs by 1927, turning a global food capital into an open sewer. In 2014, scientists, students, and skeptics gambled on restoring millions of oysters to these poisoned tides. But what really happens to a city's identity and its future? When you try to rebuild a sunken empire shell by shell, the answer is far messier and far more revealing than anyone imagined. Long before concrete and steel, New York Harbor was defined by something quieter but far more powerful: oysters. The scale almost defies belief. 220,000 acres of living reefs stretched across the estuary, a submerged landscape so dense that ships arriving from Europe had to plot careful courses to avoid grounding on their jagged edges. For the Lenape, these reefs were more than a food source. Generations gathered oysters in the shallows, stacking their discarded shells into middens that still surface in archaeological digs across Staten Island and the Bronx. Each layer tells a story of seasonal harvests, communal feasts, and rituals tied to the tides. Oysters shaped the city's earliest economy. Dutch settlers arriving in the 17th century found the harbor teeming with shellfish. They mapped shipping lanes around the reefs and soon began dredging channels to make way for commerce. The shells themselves became building material, crushed for mortar, piled up to expand the shoreline, and even used as currency in trade. By the 19th century, oysters had become New York's signature dish, sold by the bucket on street corners and served in every tavern from the Bowery to Broadway. The city earned a reputation as the oyster capital of the world. The reefs did more than feed a growing metropolis. They filtered the harbor's water, each oyster straining out plankton and sediment and helping to keep the estuary clear. Tangled clusters of shells created shelter for fish, crabs, and shrimp, drawing a web of marine life close to shore. During storms, the reefs broke the force of incoming waves, protecting the fragile edge of Manhattan from erosion and flooding. For centuries, this living infrastructure allowed both people and wildlife to thrive side by side. Evidence of this abundance is found not just in old maps and city records, but in the ground itself. Layers of oyster shells, some several meters thick, mark the sites of ancient feasts and colonial expansion. Early Dutch maps show reefs as navigational hazards, while city planners used oyster shells to build out the Battery and to line the foundations of new neighborhoods. Even today, the bones of that lost empire lie beneath the city's streets and parks, a silent record of a time when the harbor's riches seemed endless. By the late 19th century, oysters had become so woven into daily life that their absence was unthinkable. The city's appetite seemed boundless, and the reefs, vast as they were, felt inexhaustible. But beneath the surface, the balance that had held for thousands of years was beginning to slip. Oyster reefs that once seemed endless began to vanish in a matter of decades. By the turn of the 20th century, the city's appetite for oysters had outpaced nature's ability to replenish them. Harvesters scraped the beds bare, dredging deeper and farther with every passing year. The reefs, once thick enough to block ships, shrank to scattered remnants, but overfishing was only the beginning. As New York's population exploded, the harbor became the city's dumping ground. Untreated sewage, industrial waste, and runoff poured into the water day after day. Combined sewer overflows sent torrents of stormwater and raw waste into the estuary with every heavy rain. The water, once clear enough to see the bottom, turned murky and foul. Oxygen levels dropped, suffocating marine life. Parasites and disease swept through the remaining oyster beds, killing off what little survived. By the 1920s, the consequences were impossible to ignore. Oysters pulled from the harbor grew smaller and sicklier each season. Shellfish illnesses spiked, and cases of food poisoning traced to local oysters made headlines. In 1927, health officials took drastic action. The last commercial oyster grounds in New York Harbor were ordered shut. Shellfish from these waters were declared unsafe to eat. For the first time in centuries, the city's most iconic food disappeared from its own shoreline. The ban was not just a blow to the economy. It was an admission that the harbor had become too dangerous for even the hardiest species to survive. The stigma stuck. Newspapers and city officials began to call the harbor an open sewer. The phrase captured the public's sense of loss and disgust. What had once been a symbol of abundance and resilience now stood as a warning. The water was considered nearly dead. For decades, the only signs of life were the swirling currents of waste and the occasional scavenger picking through the filth. The city turned its back on the waterfront, building walls and highways to keep the stench and memory at bay. The collapse of the oyster reefs was not a slow fade, it was a crash, a sudden and public unraveling of a relationship that had shaped the city from its earliest days. The harbor's fall from grace was complete. Its transformation from engine of abundance to environmental cautionary tale was written in headlines and health department warnings. In 1972, the rules for New York Harbor changed overnight. The Clean Water Act, passed by Congress that year, made it illegal to dump untreated sewage into American waterways. For decades, the city's waste had flowed directly into the estuary, clouding the water and choking out nearly all marine life. Now, federal law demanded a new approach. New York began the slow, expensive work of building wastewater treatment plants. Concrete tanks and underground pipes took shape across the boroughs, designed to capture and clean the torrents that once emptied straight into the harbor. The results did not appear immediately. Years of pollution could not be erased in a single season. But over time, the water began to clear. Fish that had vanished from the city's memory started to return to forgotten inlets and piers. In the early 2000s, scientists and curious locals discovered something unexpected: wild oysters clinging to old pilings and rocky outcrops. These scattered survivors were not enough to revive the lost reefs, but they proved that the harbor's wounds were not beyond healing. The Clean Water Act did not restore the ecosystem by itself, but it forced a shift in how the city treated its water and its shoreline. The law cracked open a door that had been closed for generations, making it possible to imagine a future where oysters and the life they supported could return to New York Harbor. In 2014, two educators, Pete Malinowski and Murray Fisher, stood on Governor's Island with a vision that seemed almost impossible: to restore 1 billion oysters to New York Harbor. The harbor, once written off as lifeless, became their classroom and laboratory. The first step was as gritty as it was ambitious. Students from the harbor school began hauling buckets of discarded oyster shells from restaurants across Manhattan and Brooklyn. Each shell, scraped clean and stacked in sunlit curing yards, became a building block for the future. By the end of that first year, the project had collected over 100,000 pounds of shells, enough to form a mountain of possibility. The process was hands-on from the start. Students learned to seed each shell with microscopic oyster larvae, bred in tanks just yards from the water's edge. The work demanded patience and precision. Larvae no bigger than a grain of sand had to be coaxed to settle on the shells and begin their transformation. Once ready, the shells were loaded into cages and reef balls, then ferried out into the harbor's murky shallows. Every shell seeded was a vote of confidence in the harbor's recovery and in the people betting on it. The Billion Oyster Project was not just about numbers. It was about proving that restoration could be driven by students and volunteers, not only by scientists in distant labs. The 1 billion goal set the bar high, but it gave every participant a stake in the outcome. What began as an experiment in education quickly became a citywide movement. fueled by hope, hard labor, and the belief that New York's harbor could still be reborn. Permits piled up faster than oyster shells. Every new reef demanded a stack of paperwork. City, state, and federal agencies each required their own forms, reviews, and signatures. In New Jersey, a poaching scare had triggered a blanket ban on oyster restoration in polluted waters, casting a shadow across the entire estuary. Regulators on both sides of the Hudson wanted guarantees: no harvesting, no shortcuts, and no risk of shellfish ending up on dinner plates. The rules were strict, and the scrutiny was constant. Students and volunteers found themselves acting as both scientists and compliance officers. Underwater cameras tracked each cage. RFID tags logged the movement and growth of oysters, creating a digital trail for every reef. Warning signs in bright colors dotted the shoreline, spelling out in plain language that these oysters were not for eating. Every step was monitored, measured, and reported back to agencies wary of any misstep. Skepticism ran deep. Some officials dismissed the entire effort as a science fair stunt, a well-meaning but naive experiment that could never bring real change to a harbor this damaged. To many in power, the idea of students and teachers restoring a lost ecosystem sounded more like wishful thinking than a genuine solution. Yet the work continued, reef by reef, shell by shell, with each new hurdle forcing the team to become more resourceful and determined. The stakes were clear. If the project failed, it would not just set back restoration, it would reinforce the belief that New York Harbor was beyond saving. In the heart of Hudson River Park, the experiment moved from hope to hard data. Scientists and students lowered clusters of concrete reef balls and wire gabions seeded with millions of oysters spat into the river's currents. The results were impossible to ignore. Within 3 years, more than 35 million spat had settled onto these structures, transforming bare substrate into living reef. Survey dives brought back images of blue crabs, oyster toadfish, mud snails, and delicate shrimp weaving through the growing oyster clusters. The reef balls themselves supported 32 different species, while the gabion cages hosted 37, a diversity that had vanished from these waters for generations. But the most surprising proof surfaced farther upriver at the Tappan Zee site. Here, researchers left sections of bare shell and rock, with no hatchery raised spat added. The question was simple: could the harbor's wild oyster larvae, drifting unseen in the water, find and colonize these blank slates? The answer came in the form of a boom. 5.8 million wild oysters settled naturally, without human intervention. For the first time in living memory, the river produced a spontaneous generation of oysters, a sign that water quality and ecological conditions had crossed a threshold. Marine scientists who had spent decades tracking the harbor's decline now found themselves tallying species lists and oyster counts that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. The reefs functioned as more than just oyster nurseries. They filtered water, provided shelter, and rebuilt the food web from the ground up. Each new survey revealed more evidence: juvenile fish darting between shells, tiny shrimp clinging to the reef matrix, blue crabs staking out territory among the clusters. The data told a clear story. Given the right structure and a chance to recover, New York Harbor's ecosystem could begin to heal itself. The experiment had become evidence, and the skeptics had to reckon with results measured not in promises, but in living reefs. Measured by any standard, the restoration has reached a scale few would have predicted. Today, more than 130 million live oysters anchor nearly 19 acres of reef scattered throughout the harbor, a living network roughly the size of 14 football fields. Over 2 million pounds of shells, once destined for landfill, now serve as the backbone of these habitats, each shell layered with new life and possibility. But the numbers, impressive as they are, tell only part of the story. Beneath the surface, the work remains fragile. Oysters face threats that statistics alone cannot capture. Disease is a constant adversary. Pathogens like dermo and MSX, nearly invisible but devastating, can sweep through a population in a single season, leaving empty shells where thriving clusters had been. In some years, entire reefs have suffered sudden die-offs, victims of microscopic invaders that thrive in warming, stressed waters. Each outbreak forces a reckoning. As scientists and engineers scramble to adapt, they have shifted from traditional reef structures to modular cages, placing oysters deeper in the water column where temperatures are more stable and disease pressure eases, at least for a time. The city's infrastructure brings its own risks. Combined sewer overflows, triggered by heavy rains, still pour untreated waste into the harbor. After major storms, the water can turn hostile overnight, exposing reefs to pollution pulses that set back months of growth. Dock failures and heat waves have wiped out large sections of carefully seeded oysters, pushing engineers to redesign moorings and experiment with more resilient placements. Each setback is a reminder that even with new technology and decades of learning, restoration in a living city is never simple. Strict no-harvest rules remain in force. Despite cleaner water and growing reefs, these oysters cannot be eaten. Regulators insist on constant monitoring, RFID tagging, and warning signs at every site. The reefs are built for habitat, water filtration, and shoreline protection, not for harvest. The project's success is measured in ecological function, not in bushels hauled to market. Oysters alone cannot solve every problem facing the harbor. They complement, but do not replace, the city's $45 billion investment in wastewater upgrades. Each living reef is a step toward recovery, but the work is ongoing and always at risk. The story of New York's oysters is not a simple comeback, but a lesson in persistence, where every gain is hard-won and every season brings new challenges. Right now, over 130 million live oysters filter New York's harbor. That is proof that ecological repair is possible, even in the shadow of a metropolis. Yet every new reef faces threats from disease, pollution, and climate extremes. Restoration is not a finish line. It is an ongoing pact with the water. What we choose to rebuild today will decide the harbor's fate for generations. Share your thoughts on what the future should hold.